Hello, I'm Pastor Michael Shultz. I'm back here in my office for the 14th edition of our study through the book of Proverbs. And I hope that you're enjoying this. As we dive into the 14th chapter of the book of Proverbs, we see a bit of a diversion from what we've seen in the previous chapters up to this point, all the way from chapter 1. And that chapters 1 through 13 primarily deal with either the person of wisdom or the admonitions of the wise father, or simply the father is giving admonitions to his own children. This chapter commences in verse 1 talking about a wise woman. This is a bit different from what we see in other chapters, that sometimes it does refer to the mother, but never does it actually take the perspective of simply being about a wise woman. So I think that this is an interesting new direction that we're looking at in this chapter. This chapter does have some echoes to previous chapters. For instance, in one of the verses it talks about how that a wise man will be benefited by the words that come out of his mouth, whereas the foolish or the wicked man will be detrimented by those things. And this is a maxim that continues throughout the book of Proverbs. But as we look through most of chapter 14, we see some very new concepts that I want to dive into. I want to spend a lot of time looking at verse 1 because it's very important, and then we'll get into the rest. So verse 1 of chapter 14 says, "Every wise woman builds her house." We'll stop there for a moment. Remember, when it says that somebody is wise, what does that mean? It means first and foremost that this is somebody who fears the Lord, because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. This is somebody who's God-fearing, they respect God, they're a godly person. But through the rest of the chapters here, we found that this is somebody who is patient and kind and frugal, and they're loving and they're charitable, and they're thoughtful and they're wise. Of course, a wise woman would be wise. But all of these characteristics are kind of lumped together under somebody who's defined as strictly being wise. And what does it mean when it says that she builds her house? So of course it doesn't literally mean she goes out and she becomes a contractor and she builds a house. I think that what this is saying is more of an analogy, because to build a house is actually an excellent analogy for building relationships, both with her husband and with her children. It's a perfect analogy for spiritual and familial growth. It's brick by brick. There are different aspects of it. If you've ever worked in construction, I've worked a little bit in construction and worked a lot in actually dealing with construction workers and carpenters and putting up the materials that they need. This woman knows that you're going to have to acquire materials. You're going to have a plan before you start. You're going to have to be patient. You're going to have to be wise. You're going to have to prioritize. You're going to have to be resilient through difficulties and problems that come up that you weren't expecting. You're going to have to be understanding that things are going to happen that you're not ready for. But also, she understands that this is a continual process that you have to take account for. You don't just dive into a relationship because you're alone. You don't just dive into a relationship because you want somebody to be with. A lot of people do this in our culture today. They're just lonely, and so they think that if they get into a relationship, that'll fix it. But you don't just buy a house because you think you'd like to have a better house. It's a bigger commitment than that. And imagine how big of a commitment it is to dive into a relationship, or especially to have children. That commitment is huge. And so this brick by brick building of a relationship and of a life is a good analogy for spiritual and familial growth. This is a woman who takes care of her entire household. She makes her household thrive just by caring for it. She makes wise choices in her relationships with both her husband and her children, and she works hard on her relationships continually in the same way that she would in building a house. There's a difference in the different aspects. You have to have a foundation, but you also have to have developments on top of it, or it's not a house. You have to have a structure inside, the bare bones of the structure itself, but you also have to have cosmetics. Nobody wants to live in a house that's just 2x4s and bare lumber. You have to have drywall and paint and all of this. And this analogy goes deep into relationships. Having a relationship is not simply putting a ring on your finger and saying, "I'm married." It's not simply living together. It's not simply having conjoined bank accounts. There's a lot that goes into it. I need to know this person, and I've got to be understanding of the difficulties that they go through in life, as well as the difficulties that my children are going through, the place that they are in their lives at this moment. You know, the problems that a 12-year-old deal with are a lot different than the problems that a 40-year-old deal with. And you've got to be able to understand what they're dealing with so that you don't do something rash, okay? So this woman is very smart, she's patient, she's resilient, and she's building something in a wise and slow and steady way, okay? Jesus would actually say a parable later of What man wanting to complete a project would not sit down first and count the cost to see if he has the ability to complete it, lest he become entrenched in it in the middle of it, people mock him for not being able to complete it. Before you dive into a relationship or before you make the decision to have children, you should take account of the things that it's going to require of you. It's going to require a lot of time, a lot of commitment, a lot of emotional strain and commitment, a lot of financial strain and commitment. Are you ready for that? And this is somebody who has prepared for that, and they're willing to go through the steps of doing it right. She's a wise woman. In contrast, the second half of the verse tells us about the foolish woman. The foolish woman plucks it down or tears it down with her own hands. And in our culture, in our society, we often will call these people homewreckers. But oftentimes, the connotation of homewrecker relates to somebody outside the home that comes into a perfectly good home and ruins it. But that's not always the case. A lot of the time, people, whether they're male or female, will destroy a family from the inside. They just can't be happy. You ever known anybody like this? They're totally dissatisfied with everything. They might have a perfectly good family with perfectly healthy and happy kids and a perfectly healthy and happy spouse, but there's just something, they're just not happy. They're never going to be satisfied. They're not fulfilled by it. They expect everything to work immediately. They don't want to work out problems. They don't want to sit down and talk. They don't want to go through counseling. They don't want to express themselves emotionally or mentally. They don't want to go through the problems. They want it to work immediately. They want to take no responsibility for the problems that have come up, and they don't want to take any responsibility for how that the relationship was built in the first place. Everything is somebody else's fault. And they don't want to work on making intimacy work. And intimacy is more than just physical expression. It's mental and emotional. And any woman will tell you this, that there's an element of intimacy that goes above the physical expression that a lot of men think intimacy relates to. It is a mental relationship. It is an emotional relationship. If you can't sense when something's wrong with me, you're not paying attention. And a lot of men get upset at that. Well, how am I supposed to know that something's wrong? You're supposed to pay attention. You have to look. You have to listen. You have to feel. And if you don't want to build that intimacy where you can feel when something's wrong just by being around this person, then you don't need to be in a relationship. You're not ready for that. And this person, this foolish person, foolish woman or foolish man, the homewrecker, they're willing to tear down the things that everybody else has worked to build and the things that they've worked to build just because they're dissatisfied with it. Their lack of commitment, their lack of interest, their lack of patience, their lack of resilience, their idleness, their actions, and their tongue, more than anything, is going to destroy these relationships because they're foolish. They don't want to build. They don't have any resilience. They don't have any persistence. And they're totally foolish. They are the opposite of this wise woman who was prepared, who took account whether she had the ability to fulfill her commitment and builds brick by brick, understanding the difficulty with which this is going to be accomplished. So, we move on into verse 4. I want to look at this. This is a very interesting and an excellent proverb for everyone. Where no oxen are, the crib is clean, but much increase is by the strength of the ox. Now, this is an interesting one, and I feel this personally because I pastor a small rural country church. And in a lot of small community, country, rural churches, this is something that should be hanging over the doors as you walk in. Because what this proverb would literally translate to, if you wanted to put it simply, you could just say, where there is no progress, there are no problems. And we might think that that's backwards. We might say, well, no, where there's no progress, there's nothing but problems. But in most rural community country churches, it's the opposite. The mindset's totally backwards. The status quo is the goal. We don't want anything to change. We don't want anything to be different. We don't want to go through any transitions. We don't want any sort of differences being made. We want exactly what we've got. But here's the caveat. We want it to work. This is what you'll see a lot of the time. A church 15, 20 years ago will have developed a plan. And it'll be a missionary plan or a mission plan or an outreach plan. Something that would have worked 15 or 20 years ago, and it did. And they had 100 or 150 people at the church. And then just over time, whether it's by death or people leaving, going to other churches, or the children being born, and they decide that they want to go to another church that offers something different, these community country churches shrink, and before you know it, they're down to 30 or 40 people. And they're looking 5, 10 years out, wondering if they're going to be able to afford financially to keep the church open. They're looking at closing the doors. And what'll happen is you bring a new minister in and they say, okay, we want you to help us because we're obviously in some sort of a slump. The minister will say, okay, well, I've got some ideas. You do this and you do this. And these things don't work. And I can tell you they don't work because the church is shrinking and it's failing, and they're the primary goals. So we want to do away with those and bring in this and this. Because I know that this works. I've done it before. And what happens? The church says, no, we don't want to change anything. He says, you don't want to change anything? No, we want what we're doing to work. If somebody said they'd like to lose weight, and you said, okay, well, let's look at your diet. And they said, well, every day I have McDonald's 3 times a day, and I don't exercise at all. And you say, okay, well, we're going to have to get you to stop eating McDonald's, and you're going to have to start exercising. And they say, oh, no, you misunderstand me. I want to lose weight and become healthier, but I don't want to change my diet, and I don't want to exercise. Well, that's silly. Of course you're going to have to change some things to make progress. And what this says is, you might peek your head in the barn and see how beautiful and clean the mangers are without any animals or livestock in there. But when the harvest comes, you're not going to have any harvest because you didn't have any work animals. You didn't put any work in. You may not have wanted to clean up after the oxen. You may not have wanted to clean up after the horses and the mules. But that's part of the job if you want to have a harvest. And so if you want progress, sometimes you've got to deal with difficulties. Sometimes you've got to deal with disturbances, because those disturbances are necessary to make progress. If you're not willing to put up with some hardships, and you want to have change but not, it's not going to work. You're not going to get any progress. And this is a huge point for small country churches, so I hope that you can meditate on this. Let's read that again. Proverbs 14 and verse 4, where there are no oxen, the crib is clean, but much increase is by the strength of the ox. That's awesome. That's awesome. Let's skip on down to verse 12. There is a way that seems right unto man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Now, I'm really just touching on this because I've mentioned it several times in our study through the book of Proverbs. This is an important maxim to keep in mind. And the simple explanation of this is, if you don't seek wise counsel, and you're not willing to listen to advice from people that are smarter or wiser or more experienced than you, you're going to fall into a pit. You're the blind leading the blind. It's not your place to say, I know what I'm doing, when you really don't. So, verse 12, there's a way that seems right. Yeah, keep listening to your own intuition and see what happens to you. Keep following your own ideas when you have no idea what you're doing and see where it goes. Because the ultimate end of it is the way of death. That's what the Bible tells you. So be very careful in that. Now in verses 17 through 31, we have a topic that actually rises in several verses. And the topic is temperament. How to control a temper and what the wise will be able to do in reference to their temper. So let's look at verse 17. First of all, he that is soon angry deals foolishly. Look at verse 21. He that despises his neighbor is a sinner, but he that has mercy on the poor is very happy. Let's look at verse 29. He that is slow to wrath is of great understanding, but he that is hasty of spirit exalts folly. Look at verse 31. He that oppresses the poor reproaches his maker, but he that honors him has mercy on the poor. Now remember this is a tone that goes through the Bible, Old Testament and New. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. It is not our place to exact justice. It is God's place to bring vengeance and justice on everything, and He will reconcile all things unto Himself in the end, either by hell or on the cross. There will be no injustice remaining. Every account will be rendered settled in the end. So you don't have to worry about people wronging you and making it up to them. You don't have to worry about going out and getting retribution or revenge. We are not meant to do that. The people who can control their tempers are going to be greatly benefited in this life because they're going to be able to think rationally in a difficult situation. And then you can see this, we call them hotheads. Hotheads just fly off the hinge, fly off the shelf, however you might want to say. They just go crazy. And everybody knows them. And you know what happens? You say you're at a soccer game or a football game or a baseball game, you see one of the parents just fly off the hinges, or maybe the coach does. And you know what happens immediately when you lose yourself in that moment, and your temper and your rage and your wrath? Everybody loses respect for you. Because they know you are incapable of controlling yourself. Control is a very important characteristic for a righteous and a wise person to have. And it's even more important because the person that you're going off on, whether they're somebody that you know or not, verse 31 makes it very clear. Everyone that you would possibly oppress is you're actually oppressing their maker. You're reproaching their maker for making them that way. And who is their maker but God? We are all image bearers. We all have the Imago Dei resting on us, God's reflection on us. So what we have is when you go off on somebody in wrath and anger and you're unable to control your temper, you're actually reproaching a small icon, or what might we say? An avatar of God. This is a small representation of God. This person, in all of their faults and all of their imperfections, they are image bearers of God. And when you go off on them and act like they're the most wicked, sorry, pathetic, helpless, hopeless little thing, you're actually reproaching their maker because he created them. So you got to be very careful how that you treat other people. I want to finish up with verse 23 because this is very important as far as its spiritual implications. Verse 23, in all labor there is profit, but talk of the lips tends only to penury or poverty. Have you ever met somebody that's all talk? You know, I have so much respect for missionaries that are actually willing, unlike most Christians, or people that claim to be Christians at least, to follow Christ in his call to give up everything and to go abroad all across the world and actually tell other people about Jesus Christ and to build the kingdom that we are all called to build. I have so much respect for that because you see this in churches all the time. There are people who are all talk. They talk about missions, they talk about kingdom building, but when the time comes to do it, they just don't have the time, they just don't have the money, something's come up, or they're sick, or they're too old, or they're not going to be of any worth on the trip anyway. They just get in the way, they'll slow things down. They're all talk. And what this says is, any kind of labor that's done is for a profit. You will gain, you will be blessed, you will become wealthier in that labor. But the people who are all talk will be impoverished. And the spiritual implications of this are so immense. I mean, it's so much worse to be spiritually poor than it is to be financially poor. And it's so much better to be spiritually wealthy than it is to be financially wealthy. I'll give you two examples and we'll be done. Somebody who is spiritually wealthy is the Apostle Paul. He says, I've given up everything. I bear the marks of a slave. I'm a bondslave of Jesus Christ. I bow my knee unto the Father. And because he bowed his knee to the Father, he never bowed his knee to anybody else. Not demons, nor politicians or kings. He would stand in front of all of them as a representative of the King of the King of the heaven, the King of the kingdom of heaven, which was God. He was a representative of God everywhere that he went. He was so spiritually wealthy that it didn't matter that he was poor. It didn't matter that he had nothing. He was spiritually wealthy. And in heaven, he's blessed. He says, there's a crown prepared for me that I'll lay at Jesus' feet. He has so much wealth in heaven because he was not worried about making a profit on earth. He was only concerned with profiting Christ and his kingdom on this earth. And he was so blessed when he got into heaven because of that. But in contrast, somebody who was all talk and somebody who's spiritually poor was Judas. Judas walked with Jesus and heard all of his parables and pretended to apply them to his life. He was there from the beginning. He was chosen as one of the inner 12. And he was there for every miracle, every moment of spectacular ecstasy that they might have experienced with Jesus. He saw it all, and he pretended to be one of them. But he was all talk. Because when the time came to actually do something, he was one that ran away. He was one that sold him. He was the one that betrayed him. He just wasn't there when times got hard. He was all talk. And he took all the money that he had profited from his work on earth and he went and bought a rope with it. And that's the same thing that most Christians are going to do. They're going to walk around us earth so many days. That's the days of man are numbered in the eyes of God. They get to walk on this earth for so many days. And at the end of it, all of their work and all of their labor and all their strife will have been for nothing because they didn't do anything for the profit of Christ or for his kingdom. They did everything for their own selves. And everything that they've earned will die with them and it'll burn up when this world is consumed. Nevertheless, the people that walked around them doing mission work and building the kingdom and working for the profit of Christ will receive an inheritance on the other side. And how sad it will be to arrive in heaven as a pauper, to be totally poor in the sight of God because you did nothing for Him. You only related to God in so much as it benefited you because you just wanted to go to heaven. You didn't want to build the kingdom. You didn't want to do mission work. You didn't want to do anything for the cause of Christ. You just didn't want to go to hell. I don't have anything to say other than that the work that's done for the cause of Christ will be profiting, but the talkers, the people who are all talk, will be impoverished on the other side. This has been a brief run through the 14th chapter of the book of Proverbs. I hope that you're enjoying this study. Share this video, leave a comment, and if you have any insights that I've not covered, leave them down below. I'd love to see them. I want to thank you again for listening in. I'm Pastor Michael Shultz, and be blessed.